Okay, so this one is about online spaces and online spaces that kind of brush up against conspiracy theory, and specifically the targeted individuals subculture. And I'll say up front a couple of things. The first is that there are mixed opinions on the value of these spaces for people with psychosis and paranoia and ongoing symptoms. Um, so I'm not going to condemn these spaces, right? Because I'm aware that there are some people who actually find this information, although I'm hesitant to call it information. I don't really know because it again it flirts with conspiracy theory. Um, Quite helpful for making sense of their experiences. But I will tell you from my own experience what my engagement with the targeted individuals subculture was like, um, and how I made sense of it, and whether or not I found it helpful. Um, so in the weeks leading up to my first psychosis, um, I was going through a prodrome, and there are parts of that prodrome that I haven't talked about in the Androids playlist. And I'm not going to add this video to the Androids playlist. I'm going to keep this separate. Um, but there were a few things that started to happen, right? Um, and my behavior became increasingly more and more bizarre. So the first thing that happened was somatic stuff. I have talked about this kind of fear of urinary incontinence that was not necessarily triggered by a lecturer, but was that sort of occurred in response to something that this lecturer had said. So he was giving a lecture on Freud, very entry level. It was a creative writing course. We were just being told about the id, the ego, and the superego, and the kind of iceberg of the conscious and the unconscious. Um, and he said to the entire lecture hall, essentially your id is what stops you pissing yourself in the street. And I remember having a full body response to those words. Like, it wasn't quite chills, it wasn't quite um, a a shock or anything like that, but it was almost like a sudden activation of my autonomic nervous system. I started buzzing, right? And I remember thinking, because I had no knowledge of psychology, I didn't know that this was just a theory. I thought this actually directly mapped onto the brain in some way. And so I was like, so we have this thing called the id. What if it fails? I'm going to piss myself in the street. And I became preoccupied with pissing myself in the street. And again, this kind of goes back to sort of this the theme of this fear of judgment, evaluation, and how that kind of maps onto my need to monitor my use of language in order to survive the environments I often found myself in, both at school and elsewhere. Um, and alongside that preoccupation, I also developed other concerns, like that I might have some sort of parasitic infection, like I might have worms or I might have a tapeworm. I became quite concerned with the idea that I might have a tapeworm, and I was researching various treatments, and I ended up discovering that you can't actually get tapeworm medication over the counter. You have to actually go to a doctor, and a doctor has to identify the presence of a tapeworm in order to give you tapeworm medication. And so I started getting very fixated on that. And then for a couple of weeks, I found on a sort of alternative medicine website a remedy for deworming dogs, which involved eating oats or mixing pumpkin seeds, raw pumpkin seeds, black molasses, and oats, rolled oats or something, or steel cut, milled, some fucking oat specific oat thing that was cut in a certain, I don't know, I don't understand oat manufacturing in enough detail to be specific there, but something to do with steel cut rolled oats or some shit. Anyway, I went to the health food shop and I bought the ingredients that I needed to make this at home dog deworming formula, and I ate it and nothing else 3 times a day for about 4 weeks, because I was convinced that I had some sort of parasite and I was going to flush it out using this natural remedy. While this was going on, I also developed this idea as I was going to sleep. I could feel something in my ear. And I then became concerned that there was some sort of spider living in my ear or something like that. So I went to the pharmacy and I bought ear cleaning solution, like this kind of acid solution that dissolved earwax. And I put that in my ear and I left it in for 10-15 minutes, and then I flushed my ear. And something actually came out, a very big ball of earwax with worms in it. What looked like worms. They just a lump of wax with a load of tendrils coming out of it. And it lay at the bottom of the sink under about 2 inches of water, and I just stared at it in disbelief, like there was something in my ear. Looking back, could have been a hallucination. Got no idea. I was not in a place of clarity at that point in the run-up to my first psychosis. So I could have hallucinated that entirely. However, I have found online that that's pretty standard if you've got worms in your ear. It can happen, and they do get stuck in the earwax, and that's what they look like when they come out, so who knows. Anyway, I also end up ordering from an online pharmacy some deworming tablets. Anyway, I just became fixated on this sort of parasite. Something was in my body. Things were in my body, and I had to get them out. Now, this led me to the targeted individuals subculture, right? So in the course of looking for all this information about what's inside my body and how do I get it out, all this kind of what I suppose you would call overvalued ideas of like a somatic nature, right? They weren't quite somatic delusions because I didn't hold them with complete conviction. These were very much working hypotheses. Like, maybe I have worms, maybe I have a tapeworm, maybe the movement and the noise I feel in my ear is like a parasite, maybe this, that, and the other. So, I had these overvalued somatic ideas. And I was taking all kinds of things. Like I said, I was eating natural remedies and nothing else. I don't think eating huge quantities of black molasses and pumpkin seeds and oats is very good for you when you're in the prodrome. That probably made things worse. But I ended up on the internet, and I ended up on the targeted individuals forums, where people would post photographs of their eye. You know, they'd taken a photograph of their eye in the mirror, and they'd say, "Look, I can see the camera in my eye." And so this kind of funneled me from the overvalued somatic ideas to gang stalking, targeted individual, and conspiracy theory stuff. So it went from there's something in my body to there are things in my body that other people have put there because I'm vocal about conspiracy theories. Before the prodrome, I was a vocal skeptic of, you name it, whatever, right? I've always been interested in conspiracy theories. I had a book when I was a kid of like weird coincidences about, you know, Lincoln and JFK's assassinations occurring on similar dates or some shit. Anyway, it was just a book full of that. Looking back, probably not good primer material for a child who would later develop schizophrenia. But I stumbled on these forums, and I suddenly found myself surrounded by an online community of people who were having the same experiences as me. And for me, this was confirmation that it was happening, because other people were reporting it. It was social proof, right? I wasn't alone. I wasn't imagining things. There's all this documentation. There's all this evidence of things going on. And then I started to retrofit this idea onto experiences I'd had. Like, for example, I was walking through Falmouth town one evening, and I walked up a very steep hill from the high street to the student accommodation. And as I turned around the corner, there were two men who were not students, they were locals. And one of them shouted at me. And I stopped moving and I looked at them, didn't say anything, looked around, didn't say anything, and then carried on walking to the student accommodation. And one of them said to the other, "Oh, what do you know? A hard student." And that was, as I understand it now, and as I understood it at the time, rooted in the animosity between the locals in Falmouth and the student population. They've always been in mild conflict. That's just, I don't know what it's like now, but 10 years ago there was a lot of tension between the student population and the locals. And I'm not making this up. It was in the newspapers, you know. And a lot of the students didn't help themselves, you know, blaring music at 4 a.m. You're not going to be popular if you do stuff like that. So there was stuff like that going on, right? I remember going to buy a suit for my grandfather's funeral. And I walked out of the shop and walked past a couple in the high street. And one of the guys turned to his wife and said, "We're paying for that." So there was, again, an animosity, you know, towards students. And that fed into this gang stalking idea. So I became more and more and more convinced that there was a relationship between my vocalization of conspiracy theories and the animosity I was getting from the locals. And that this, combined with the information I was getting from this online community, was confirmation that I was being monitored, surveilled, that I was on some kind of watch list, that I was a problem that needed to be solved. And then when I became unwell, some of my ideas about being killed were influenced partly by that and partly by other things that had gone on nearer the episode, being on social media, seeing social media posts as personally relevant and that sort of thing. So this is a phase of my program that I haven't talked about in other videos. I tell you all of this because I'm of the opinion that the targeted individuals online spaces are not helpful for people who are slipping into psychosis. Their social nature and their capacity to act as social proof to delusional perception, I think, is very dangerous. There is some stuff out there that says that there are some people who find these spaces helpful. I'm not personally of the opinion that they are for me, because they can funnel people from much more personal and idiosyncratic delusional content to communal delusional content. And that can be quite persuasive. Because in my experience, when you start to experience psychosis, the quality of the sources that you're looking at become less important in terms of the evidential weight that you apply to what you're looking at. A forum becomes just as authoritative as a newspaper article. And so I'm not sure that these spaces are actually particularly helpful. But I recognize that if people are reporting that they find a sense of belonging in these communities, and they find the ideas that circulate in these communities beneficial in some way as a way of making sense of their experiences, then I'm willing to concede that and respect that. But from my own personal experience, they greatly worsened things for me and may have tipped me in the direction that I eventually went. Because I ended up coping with the anxiety and the paranoia by smoking more and more cannabis. So to sort of numb myself to this idea that I was being followed, that I was being watched, that things that were happening around me, innocuous things, were constructed, planned. Again, we're going back to Philip K. Dick with the Adjustment Bureau. The idea that there's this in the Adjustment Bureau, it's a largely benevolent conspiracy, but if you take that idea that there is a upper echelon, not necessarily of government, but some kind of administrative upper echelon, directing the lives of individuals and intervening on the natural course of their lives by dropping events in certain places so that people follow certain courses of action. That's very much what it felt like. So I would say the targeted individual stuff is just not particularly helpful, but I respect if some people do find it useful as a way of understanding their experiences. But personally, I've got strong reservations about those spaces and their risk potential. So there you go.